John Matthews had spent years on Orion's gate, but he had never felt more uneasy than he did now. The space station had always been a chaotic place. Traders, travelers, and mercenaries moved through its corridors daily, exchanging goods, information, and sometimes secrets. But ever since the attempted kidnapping of Kale, a subtle shift had taken place. John felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, the hush of conversations that ended too quickly when he walked past. Something was wrong. He finished his work on a docking vessel, wiping the grease from his hands as the hum of engines vibrated through the metal grating beneath his feet. The mechanic's bay was quieter than usual, the usual chatter among the workers subdued. Even his boss, a gruff old engineer named Terran, had barely said a word all day. John exhaled sharply and grabbed his tools, but before he could leave, a familiar voice called his name. "John," said Mira, stepping out from the shadows near the entrance. Her short-cropped brown hair was tucked beneath a faded cap, and her sharp green eyes scanned the area warily. Mira was a traitor, but more than that, she was a survivor, someone who had spent enough time on the edges of legality to know when danger was near. "You look like hell," she muttered, crossing her arms. John smirked tiredly. "Thanks, Mira. Always good to see you too." She didn't return the grin. Instead, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "We need to talk. Now." John's stomach tightened. He had known this conversation was coming. He glanced around the bay before nodding toward a dimly lit maintenance tunnel. They slipped inside, the sounds of the bustling station fading as the heavy door slid shut behind them. Mira leaned against the wall, her face serious. "You've got a problem, John." His heart pounded. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that gets people killed." John's fingers curled into fists. "Is this about the men who tried to take Kale?" Mira's jaw tightened. "It's more than that. There's a bounty on the kid." John felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "A bounty?" Mira nodded. "A big one. Enough to get every lowlife from here to the outer colonies sniffing around." John ran a hand through his hair. "Who put it out?" "That's the problem," Mira said. "No one knows. The job is circulating through private channels, encrypted, no name attached. That means whoever wants him has serious resources. And they don't want him dead, John. They want him alive." John's blood ran cold. "Why?" Mira shook her head. "I don't know. But I do know this. You, Lyra, and Kale need to get off Orion's gate, and soon." John exhaled through his nose, anger and fear coiling in his chest. "How much time do I have?" Mira hesitated. "Not long. People are asking questions about you. Someone's going to connect the dots, and when they do..." She trailed off, the meaning clear. John nodded, his mind already racing through options. "I need a ship," he said. Mira sighed. "I figured you'd say that. Meet me at Bay 14 tomorrow night. I'll have something for you." John placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Mira. I owe you." She smirked, but there was no humor in her eyes. "You owe me more than you know." As she disappeared down the tunnel, John leaned against the wall, his heart pounding. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't leave soon, there wouldn't be a second chance. Chapter 2: Escape Plans. John's mind raced as he made his way back to their small apartment in the lower decks of Orion's gate. The station was alive with the usual commotion, traders arguing over prices, ship crews unloading cargo, security officers patrolling the halls. But to him, everything felt darker, heavier. His gut told him that Mira was right. Time was running out. He reached their door and keyed in the access code. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the warmth of home, a stark contrast to the cold tension clawing at his chest. Lyra was sitting on the couch, brushing through Kale's silver-white hair as the boy sat cross-legged on the floor, playing with his small toy spaceship. The sight made John's heart ache. Kale was too young to understand the danger they were in. He didn't deserve this. Lyra glanced up at him, immediately sensing his distress. "John?" He closed the door and activated the security lock. "We need to leave," he said, his voice steady but firm. Lyra's glowing blue eyes widened. "What happened?" John crouched in front of her, lowering his voice. "Mira found out there's a bounty on Kale. A big one. It's spreading fast, and soon every mercenary and bounty hunter in this sector will come looking." Lyra's grip on the hairbrush tightened. "A bounty?" she whispered, her voice laced with fear. John nodded. "We don't have time to wait. I talked to Mira. She's getting us a ship. We can't stay on Orion's gate any longer." "Kale," sensing the tension in the room, looked up. "Are we going on an adventure?" John forced a smile, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair. "Yeah, buddy, a big adventure." Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she placed them on her lap. "Where would we even go?" "There's a colony on the outer rim, New Terra. It's far, independent, and off the radar of most bounty hunters." Lyra looked away, biting her lip. "John, this is my fault. They wouldn't be after Kale if—" John placed a hand over hers. "It's not your fault," he said firmly. "What matters now is getting him to safety." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, a sharp knock sounded at the door. John's instincts kicked in instantly. He grabbed the small blaster he kept under the table and motioned for Lyra to take Kale into the bedroom. She scooped the boy up, moving swiftly but silently. He approached the door cautiously, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Who is it?" A gruff voice answered, "Taryn." John's breath eased slightly, but the tension didn't leave his body. He unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to see his boss's weathered face. The old engineer's deep-set eyes flickered with something unspoken. "Let me in," Taryn said. John hesitated for only a second before stepping aside. The older man entered, glancing around before lowering his voice. "I know what's happening, John." John stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Taryn snorted. "Don't insult me. I've been around long enough to see when someone's being hunted." He folded his arms. "You're planning to run, aren't you?" John sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Yeah, I don't have a choice." Taryn exhaled through his nose. "Good, because if you stayed, you'd be dead by next week." John blinked in surprise. "You're not going to stop me?" Taryn scoffed. "Kid, I might run a mechanics bay, but I know how this station works. The people after you, they're dangerous. And the station's security? They won't lift a damn finger to help. If anything, they'll sell you out for a cut of the bounty." John clenched his jaw. He had suspected as much. Taryn reached into his jacket and pulled out a small data chip. "Here. You're going to need supplies if you're heading to the outer rim. This has access to a private supply stash. It's not much, but it'll get you enough fuel and rations to make the trip." John took the chip, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Taryn, Shut up and take it," Taryn muttered. "And don't come back, you hear me? Not unless you're sure it's safe." John nodded. "Thank you." Taryn grunted, giving him one last look before heading for the door. "Get moving. You don't have much time." As soon as he was gone, John locked the door again and turned to find Lyra standing in the hallway. She had heard everything. "We leave tomorrow night," John said, his voice heavy. Lyra nodded, holding Kale close. "Then we'd better get ready." The night before their escape was tense. John barely slept, his mind racing with what-ifs. What if Mira couldn't get the ship? What if they were ambushed before they even reached the docking bay? He checked his blaster twice and packed only what they could carry. Essentials. Food, medical supplies, Kale's favorite toy spaceship. Things that mattered. Lyra was quiet, focused. She had lived through war and loss before. She knew the stakes. Kale, thankfully, was unaware of just how much danger they were in. He fell asleep clutching his stuffed toy, his breathing steady and peaceful. John sat by the window, watching the neon glow of the station beyond the glass. The sense of home he had once felt here was gone. Orion's gate had become a cage, and the only way out was through the stars. The next evening, they made their move. John carried Kale while Lyra kept her hood up, her silver hair hidden. They moved quickly through the lower decks, staying in the shadows, avoiding security checkpoints. Mira was waiting for them at Bay 14, just as promised. The Silver Star was prepped and ready, its sleek hull reflecting the station's artificial lights. Mira tossed John the keycard. "You're clear for takeoff, but you need to go now." John nodded, ushering Lyra and Kale up the ramp. But just as he was about to board, Mira grabbed his arm. "You need to be ready," she whispered. "If they're willing to put a bounty this big on Kale, they won't stop coming." John swallowed hard. "I know." With one last look, he climbed aboard. The ship's engines rumbled to life, and as they lifted off, leaving Orion's gate behind, John knew their journey was only beginning. Because now, the real fight for survival had begun. Chapter 3. The Chase Begins. The Silver Star rocketed out of Orion's gate, its engines roaring as it pushed past the artificial gravity of the space station. John gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white. The ship trembled slightly as it left the docking bay, but within seconds they were free, drifting into the endless black of space. But John knew better than to relax. Lyra sat beside him, her hands gripping the co-pilot's controls, her eyes darting across the ship's systems. Behind them, Kale peered out of the window, his small hands pressed against the glass, staring at the vastness of the stars. "We made it," Kale whispered, awe filling his voice. John exhaled sharply. "Not yet, kid. We're just getting started." Lyra glanced at the scanner. "I don't see any pursuit yet, but that doesn't mean we're in the clear. Orion's gate has long-range patrol ships. They'll send someone after us." John cursed under his breath. He punched in the coordinates for the first leg of their journey, an asteroid field a few light-years away where they could lay low and refuel. He had picked the route carefully. It was one few sane pilots would take, full of unstable rock formations and electromagnetic interference that would scramble tracking signals. "Jumping in 5, John announced, his fingers flying over the console. The ship hummed as the jump drive engaged. A deep vibration resonated through the hull, and with a burst of light, the silver star shot into hyperspace. For a brief moment, silence filled the cabin. The streaking lights of faster-than-light travel stretched beyond the windows, and for the first time in hours, John allowed himself to breathe. But Lyra wasn't as easily convinced. "Something doesn't feel right," she murmured, checking the ship's readouts. John frowned. "What do you mean?" She shook her head. "I don't know. Just a feeling." John didn't argue. He had learned to trust Lyra's instincts, especially when it came to danger. He turned his seat around to face Kale, who was still staring out the window, wide-eyed. "How you doing, buddy?" Kale turned to him with a small smile. "I like it. It's big." John chuckled. "Yeah, space is big." Kale's smile faltered slightly. "Will the bad men find us?" John's chest tightened. He exchanged a glance with Lyra before kneeling beside Kale. "We're going somewhere safe, but no matter what happens, I promise you, I won't let anyone take you." Kale nodded, gripping John's sleeve tightly. Before John could say more, an alarm blared through the cockpit. Lyra spun toward the scanner. "Incoming ship! They must have tracked our jump signature." John cursed and jumped into the pilot's seat. "How the hell did they find us so fast?" The ship's computer chimed with an incoming transmission. A cold, static-laced voice filled the cockpit. "John Matthews, Lyra, surrender the child, and we'll make this easy." John's fingers tightened on the controls. "Who the hell are you?" A holographic image flickered onto the ship's display, a man in a black uniform with piercing yellow eyes. Commander Varric, the man who had confronted John back at Orion's gate. "I warned you, Matthews," Varric said, his expression cold. "You can't outrun us." John clenched his jaw. "Watch me." Without another word, he cut the transmission and pushed the ship into an emergency dive. The silver star banked hard, dropping out of hyperspace just on the edge of the asteroid field. Behind them, Varric's warship followed, its sleek black hull cutting through space like a predator stalking its prey. "We're outgunned," Lyra said, checking the scanners. "That ship has weapons that could rip us apart." John gritted his teeth. "Then let's make sure they don't get a clean shot." He pushed the ship's thrusters to maximum and dove into the asteroid field. Massive rocks drifted in the void, some the size of entire cities. Magnetic storms crackled through the field, sending bursts of blue energy cascading across the debris. It was a death trap, but it was their only chance. Varric's warship hesitated at the edge. Even a powerful battleship would have trouble maneuvering through such a treacherous path. John smirked. "That's right. Come and get us." Lyra's fingers danced over the controls. "I'm redirecting power to the shields, but it won't last long. We need to get out of here before they find a way to follow us in." John dodged left, skimming the surface of a massive asteroid. The ship trembled as debris scraped against the hull. A smaller rock shattered against the shields, sending a bright flash of light through the cockpit. Kale clung to his seat, wide-eyed but silent. A warning chime blared from the console. Lyra's eyes widened. "They've launched drones!" John glanced at the scanner. Small, sleek hunter drones detached from Varric's warship, weaving effortlessly through the asteroids toward them. "Damn it," John hissed. "Hold on." He pulled the ship into a tight roll, twisting through the jagged rock formations. The drones followed, their weapon systems locking on. Lyra's hands flew over the targeting controls. I've got countermeasures. She pressed a button, and a burst of flares shot from the ship, momentarily blinding the drone's sensors. 2 of them veered off course, crashing into asteroids, but the others kept coming. John spotted a narrow canyon between 2 massive rock formations. It was barely wide enough for their ship. "We're going in," he shouted. Lyra's eyes widened. "John, that's insane." "Got a better idea?" She cursed but braced herself. "Just don't kill us." John yanked the controls hard, sending the Silver Star into a sharp dive. The canyon walls loomed on either side, razor-thin margins between survival and destruction. The drones followed. John's heart pounded as he weaved through the narrow pass, banking hard left, then right, barely avoiding the jagged edges. A drone slammed into the wall behind them, exploding in a burst of fire and debris. Another followed, firing a burst of plasma at them. The blast skimmed the shields, making the ship shudder. Lyra's fingers danced over the console. "Shields are at 30%. John spotted a tight gap ahead. If he timed it right, he gritted his teeth and punched the thrusters. The Silver Star shot forward, slipping through the gap just as another asteroid drifted into place behind them. The last remaining drone wasn't so lucky. It smashed into the rock at full speed, erupting into a fiery explosion. Silence filled the cockpit. Then a single beep sounded on the scanner. Lyra checked the display. Varek's ship isn't moving. John let out a breath. "They're not stupid enough to follow us in here." Kale finally spoke, his voice small. "Did we win?" John turned back and smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "We won this round, buddy," Lyra exhaled. "But they'll be waiting for us when we come out." John's eyes darkened. "Then we don't come out." He pulled up the ship's navigation map, scanning the asteroid field. There was a hidden pocket near the center, an abandoned mining station. If they could make it there, they could hide, make repairs, and figure out their next move. Because John knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Varek wouldn't stop hunting them, and next time, the chase would be even deadlier. Chapter 4. A Desperate Escape. The Silver Star trembled as it emerged from the asteroid's tunnel system, bits of debris bouncing off its hull. John's hands were tight on the controls, sweat dripping down his brow. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but they weren't safe yet. Lyra's fingers flew across the console, assessing the damage. "Shields are down to 15%. Hull integrity is stable, but we can't take another hit like that." John cursed under his breath. The asteroid field had bought them some time, but Varek's warship was still out there, waiting like a hungry predator. Kale, still strapped into his seat, clutched his stuffed toy. "Did we win?" he asked softly. John forced a smile. "Not yet, buddy, but we will." Lyra leaned forward. "They're scanning for us. They don't have a lock yet, but the moment we break from the asteroid field, they'll be on us." John ran a hand through his hair. He knew Lyra was right. If they left now, they'd be sitting ducks. They needed another way out. He turned to the navigation map, scanning for anything that could give them an advantage. That's when he saw it. A derelict station floating on the far side of the asteroid belt. The remains of Outpost Helios, an abandoned mining facility long forgotten by the galaxy. John tapped the screen. "That's our ticket." Lyra's eyes widened. "That place has been dead for decades more. Why are we going there?" John smirked. "Because no one else would be stupid enough to follow us." Lyra exhaled sharply but didn't argue. "Fine, but if we find space pirates in there, I'm blaming you." John guided the ship through the asteroid field, weaving between jagged rock formations until the rusted husk of Outpost Helios came into view. It was a massive floating structure, its metal skeleton exposed in places, entire sections missing. A rotating ring, long inactive, drifted off kilter in space. The station was dead, or at least it should have been. John maneuvered the Silver Star toward a docking bay, angling the ship carefully as Lyra initiated the landing sequence. With a clang, the ship connected to the station. The engines powered down, and for the first time in hours there was silence. John unbuckled his seatbelt and exhaled. "All right, let's move." Kale hesitated. "Is it safe?" John knelt down beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'll check first. You stay close to your mom, okay?" Kale nodded. Lyra grabbed her blaster. "Let's make this quick." Inside the ghost station, the docking bay was dimly lit, the emergency lights flickering as John, Lyra, and Kale stepped onto the station. The air was stale, thick with dust, and the scent of old machinery filled their noses. Lyra wrinkled her nose. "Smells like something died in here." John didn't comment. He was too busy scanning the area, looking for any signs of life. The station was supposed to be abandoned, but something felt off. Kale clutched Lyra's hand. "I don't like it here." Lyra squeezed his hand gently. "We won't stay long, sweetheart." John led the way, moving through the empty corridors. The walls were covered in old graffiti, remnants of workers long gone. Some of the signs still flickered. Authorized personnel only, no oxygen beyond this point. But many were broken, their meaning lost in time. Then John saw something that made his stomach tighten. A fresh footprint in the dust. He raised a hand, signaling for Lyra to stop. "We're not alone," he whispered. Lyra's eyes darted around the shadows, her grip tightening on her blaster. A noise echoed down the hallway, a clatter of metal, then a voice. Well, look what we have here." John turned sharply, blaster raised. A man stepped out of the shadows, flanked by two others. He was tall, lean, and wore a patchwork of armor that looked salvaged from a dozen different ships. A scar ran down the side of his cheek, and his eyes gleamed with amusement. John's stomach sank. "Scavengers." The leader grinned. "Didn't think we'd get visitors today." John kept his blaster steady. "We don't want trouble," the man chuckled. "That's funny, because trouble seems to follow people who come here." Lyra stepped closer to John. "Let us pass." The scavenger tapped a metal pipe against his palm, eyes darting to Kale. "Cute kid, what's a family like yours doing in a place like this?" John's muscles tensed. He knew how these types operated. If they thought he was weak, they'd try to take everything. He needed to be careful. "We're just passing through," John said evenly. The scavenger's grin widened. "That so?" He took a step forward. His men followed. "Because to me, it looks like you're running from something, and I have to wonder." He tilted his head. "Who's after you?" John didn't answer. The scavenger sighed. "Fine, be that way." Then his hand twitched. John fired first. The blaster shot rang through the corridor, striking the scavenger's weapon, sending it clattering to the ground. His men jumped back in surprise. John leveled his gun at the leader's chest. "We're leaving, now." The man raised his hands, a smirk still on his lips. "Easy, friend. No need to get violent." John didn't lower his weapon. Lyra nudged him. "John, let's go." He took a step back, never breaking eye contact. Then he turned and led Lyra and Kale away, moving quickly down the corridor. The scavenger called after them. "This is our station, Matthews. You can't hide here forever." John didn't stop. They reached a control room at the far end of the station. Lyra activated the console, scanning for any possible escape routes. "John, there's an old maintenance hatch leading to the exterior docking ring. We might be able to launch from there." John nodded. "Then let's move." Kale tugged on John's sleeve. "That man knew your name." John's stomach tightened. Kale was right, and that meant something worse. Varric's men were already here. The scavengers weren't just looters, they were informants. John turned to Lyra. "We need to get off this station, now." Lyra didn't argue. Outside, through the cracked window of the control room, John saw it. A sleek black warship emerging from the asteroid field. Varric had found them. John gritted his teeth. The chase wasn't over. It was just getting started. Chapter 5. The Truth Revealed. John's heart pounded as he stared out the cracked window at Varric's warship, its dark hull cutting through the asteroid field like a blade. The scavengers had given them away. They were out of time. Lyra was already at the console, her fingers moving across the ancient, flickering controls. "There's a docking ring on the far side of the station. If we can get to it, we can launch from there before they reach us." John nodded, grabbing Kale's hand. "Then let's move." They slipped out of the control room and into the darkened corridors of Outpost Helios, the distant hum of the scavengers still lingering behind them. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. Kale clung to John's side, his small fingers tightening around his hand. "I don't like this place." John squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Neither do I, kid. But we'll be out of here soon." They moved quickly, their boots echoing against the metal floor. Every step brought them closer to the docking ring, but also closer to danger. Then Lyra suddenly stopped. "Wait!" John pulled up short. "What?" Lyra pointed toward a nearby doorway, partially caved in from an old explosion. Beyond it, a room flickered with faint blue light. Unlike the rest of the station, this place still had power. John frowned. We don't have time for detours, Lyra. She didn't budge. Something's here. Something important. John exhaled sharply. We're trying to escape, not sightsee. But Lyra ignored him, stepping inside. John cursed under his breath and followed, motioning for Kale to stay close. Inside, the room was lined with old, rusted consoles, their screens flashing alien symbols. Dust coated every surface and a faint hum filled the air. In the center of the room was a stasis pod. And inside the pod was a body. John's stomach clenched. What the hell is this? Lyra stepped closer, wiping dust from the glass. Beneath the frost-covered surface, a humanoid figure lay motionless. It had the same silvery blue skin as Lyra, the same delicate features, but something about it was different. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. I know him. John blinked. Lyra turned to him, her glowing blue eyes wide with shock. John, this is Varos. My husband. John's entire body locked up. What? She touched the glass, her fingers trembling. He was reported dead after the accident, but he's here. He's alive. John ran a hand through his hair. This doesn't make sense. Why would they put him in stasis and abandon him here? Lyra shook her head. I don't know, but we can't leave him. John felt a pit form in his stomach. Lyra, I get it, but we barely have time to save ourselves. Lyra's jaw tightened. I'm not leaving him, John. Before he could argue further, a voice crackled over the station's intercom. Well, this is unexpected. John froze. The voice was deep, cold, and laced with amusement. Varric. A screen flickered to life above them, showing Varric standing on the bridge of his warship, arms folded behind his back. His yellow eyes gleamed. You've led me on quite the chase, Matthews, but it ends here. John's pulse pounded. How the hell are you broadcasting inside the station? Varric chuckled. The same way I tracked you here. You underestimated me. John clenched his fists. What do you want, Varric? Varric tilted his head slightly. The child, of course. Surrender him, and I'll consider letting the rest of you go. John stepped protectively in front of Kale. Not happening. Varric's smirk never faltered. I expected as much, which is why my men are already inside. A sudden explosion rocked the station. Lyra stumbled backward as the walls trembled. John grabbed Kale, pulling him close. Lyra's eyes darted to the stasis pod. John, help me get him out, now. John gritted his teeth. They were out of options. He rushed to the control panel, scanning the ancient alien text flashing across the screen. Tell me you know how to open this thing. Lyra rapidly worked through the controls, her fingers moving with desperate precision. Almost there. A loud hiss filled the room as the pod depressurized. The glass slid open with a slow, agonizing creak. Varos gasped, his body convulsing as frost melted from his skin. His glowing eyes shot open, wild and unfocused. Lyra grabbed his face gently. Varos, it's me. He blinked rapidly, his breathing ragged. Lyra? Tears streaked down her face. You're alive. John barely had time to process what was happening before the sound of approaching footsteps filled the hallway. They're here. Lyra turned to Varos. Can you move? Varos groaned, trying to sit up. His limbs trembled, but he nodded. I think so. John didn't waste time. He grabbed Lyra's arm. We have to go. Lyra helped Varos to his feet. And the four of them bolted from the room just as armed mercenaries burst through the corridor behind them. Blaster fire erupted around them. John ducked, pulling Kale with him as energy bolts scorched the walls. Run! They tore through the station, heading toward the docking ring. The entire structure was shaking now. Varric wasn't just here to capture them. He was here to bury them. The docking ring came into view, an old rusted airlock leading to a single escape ship. John sprinted ahead, punching in the override codes. Lyra, get them aboard. She helped Varos inside first, then turned to Kale. Come on, sweetheart. Kale hesitated for only a second before climbing in. John turned, firing a few wild shots down the hallway to keep the mercenaries at bay. Then, just as he stepped inside, a voice rang out behind him. John Matthews. John spun, his blaster raised. Varric stood at the end of the hallway, his dark uniform untouched by the chaos. His golden eyes gleamed in the flickering lights. You can't run forever, Varric said. You know that. John smirked. Yeah? Watch me. Then he slammed the airlock shut. The docking ring detached. The ship's thrusters roared to life. As they blasted away from the collapsing station, John turned to find Lyra holding Varos tightly, tears streaming down her face. Kale sat beside them, his small hand clutching John's sleeve. John exhaled heavily, glancing back at the receding wreckage of Outpost Helios. They had survived, but the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. Chapter 6: A New Beginning. The Silver Star cut through the void of space, leaving behind the crumbling wreckage of Outpost Helios. The ship trembled slightly as it surged forward, its engines burning bright against the cold, endless black. Inside, the cabin was silent, except for the hum of the ship and the ragged breathing of its passengers. John finally allowed himself to breathe. He turned in his seat, his gaze sweeping over the people who had become his family. Lyra was kneeling beside Varos, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. He still looked weak, his skin pale, his limbs trembling, but his eyes were open now, and they were locked onto his wife. "You're real," Varos whispered. His voice was hoarse, heavy with emotion. I thought I was dead." Lyra let out a shaky breath. "You were as good as dead," she murmured. "We thought we lost you." John watched the reunion with a strange mix of relief and unease. He had spent so much time trying to protect Lyra and Kale, keeping them safe from the horrors that followed them. But now, Lyra's husband, the man she thought had died, was back, and that changed everything. Kale sat on the floor nearby, gripping his stuffed toy spaceship. His wide green eyes flickered between Lyra and Varos. "Are you my father?" Kale's voice was small, hesitant. Varos blinked, his face crumbling as he stared at the boy. "Kale?" His lips trembled as he reached out with an unsteady hand. Kale hesitated, then inched forward. Lyra gently guided their son closer, her own eyes glistening with tears. Varos cupped Kale's small face in his hands, his fingers shaking. His voice broke. "I never thought I'd see you again." Kale's lip quivered. "Mom said you were gone." Varos swallowed hard. "I was, but I'm here now, and I will never leave you again." The boy threw his arms around him, burying his face in Varos's chest. Varos clung to his son, his body racked with silent sobs. John turned away, giving them the moment they deserved. But where did that leave him? The road ahead. John pushed himself up and walked to the cockpit, staring out at the vastness ahead. Lyra followed him a moment later, standing silently by his side. John kept his eyes on the stars. "You should be with him," Lyra frowned. "John?" "You thought he was dead," John continued, his voice steady but distant. "But now he's back. You have a second chance." Lyra was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "That doesn't change what you've done for us." John clenched his jaw. He had fought for them, bled for them, loved them, but Varos was her husband, Kale's father. Lyra turned toward him. "John, listen to me." He finally met her gaze. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, "but I do know that you are part of our family, no matter what happens." John wanted to believe her, but deep down, he knew things could never be the same. Before he could respond, the ship's warning system chimed. Lyra's head snapped toward the console. "What now?" John slid into the pilot's seat and checked the readings. His stomach dropped. A tracking beacon had been activated. Varric was still after them. Lyra's expression darkened. "He put a tracer on us." John gritted his teeth. "Damn it, he won't stop coming." Varos, still weak, leaned against the doorway. "Then we stop running." John turned in his seat, surprised by the statement. "You have a plan?" Varos exhaled. "I was a scientist on Alea. Before my capture, I was working on something. A fail-safe, in case our enemies came for us." John's brows furrowed. "What kind of fail-safe?" Varos's eyes gleamed. "A weapon." Lyra tensed. "Varos, we can't keep running, Lyra." His voice was firm. "Varric will never stop hunting us. He doesn't just want Kale, he wants what's inside him." John's stomach twisted. "You mean his DNA?" Varos nodded. "Kale isn't just any child. He's the key to something greater." John had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the weight in his chest heavier. Varos took a deep breath. "We have one shot at this. I know where my old research facility is. If we get there before Varric does, we can activate the defense systems and end this." John stared at him, weighing the risks. Going back meant facing Varric head-on, but they were out of options. John turned to Lyra. "Are you in?" She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I trust you." John exhaled, then turned back to the controls. "All right then." He punched in the new coordinates. The ship's engines roared to life. They weren't running anymore. They were fighting back. Epilogue: The war begins. Varric stood on the bridge of his warship, watching the tracker light blink on his console. A smirk pulled at his lips. "They took the bait." His lieutenant stepped forward. "Should we pursue?" Varric's golden eyes gleamed. No need, I already know where they're going. He turned to the vast expanse of space before him. It's time to finish this. The war had begun, to be continued.